Greetings, I'm the man behind the mask, and I'd like to talk to you about hockey. Yes, let's talk about hockey, the show that journeys through the history of the sport of ice hockey from its disputed origins to the game we see today. Looking at the NHL today, there are 6 teams that are revered more above the other 24, due to their long histories that span back much farther than any other team, and the many great services they have done for the sport during those histories. We know them as the original 6, since from 1942 to 1967, they were the only teams that made up the NHL. But they go much farther back than that, and we're going to explore just how and when these legendary franchises got their start. First amongst these teams to get their start was the NHL's only current 100-plus-year-old hockey club, the Montreal Canadiens.
In November of 1909, industrialist John Ambrose O'Brien of Renfrew, Ontario, was in Montreal to purchase supplies for a railway contract. Additionally, at the request of the management of the Renfrew Creamery Kings Hockey Club, he was also there to attend the Eastern Canada Hockey Association meetings as the representative for Renfrew in its application to join the league. At the meeting, the ECHA team owners not only rejected Renfrew's application, but later that same day also chose to disband their league and form the Canadian Hockey Association in a bid to exclude the Montreal Wanderers Club, who had upset the other owners when they moved into a smaller arena that would reduce the visiting team's share of gate receipts. However, while in the lobby of the Windsor Hotel, O'Brien met the manager of the Wanderers, Jimmy Gardner, and discussed forming a new league, which would include Renfrew, the Wanderers, and 2 teams that O'Brien owned in the Ontario mining towns of Cobalt and Haileybury. Gardner also suggested that O'Brien start a team of French-speaking players based in Montreal to form a rivalry with the Wanderers. As a result, the National Hockey Association was founded on December 2, 1909, and 2 days later O'Brien financed the creation of Les Canadiens, with the intention of transferring ownership to French-speaking sportsmen in Montreal as soon as he could. At the time, French-speaking teams were not considered to be good enough to play with the top English-speaking teams. The Montreal Gazette even went as far as to warn potential fans of the new team not to get too excited, as French-Canadian players of class are not numerous. The first player to sign with the Canadiens was Didier Cannonball Petrie, an experienced forward from the Renfrew Creamery Kings. After that, it wasn't long before the club had stocked their team with French-speaking stars, including Nuzi Lalonde and Georges Poulin, and were set to commence their inaugural season. And so, on January 5, 1910, before a sellout crowd of 3,000 people, the Montreal Canadiens took to the ice for the first time ever, where they went on to defeat the Cobalt Silver Kings 7-6 in overtime.
This historic first victory, however, would end up erased from the history books shortly thereafter, as the rival CHA collapsed after only 2 weeks of play, and the NHA chose to restart the season after absorbing the Ottawa Senators and the Montreal Shamrocks from the now-deceased league. With that, the Canadiens' first game of the new season was played on January 19, 1910, and concluded in a 9-4 loss to the Renfrew Creamery Kings.
The Canadiens would then lose 3 more games before finally recording their first victory of the new season on February 7th, when they defeated the Haileybury Hockey Club by a score of 9-7. Unfortunately, they would only manage to win 1 more game for the remainder of the 12-game season, and finished dead last in the 7-team league. Following the close of this first season, the club would also change ownership, as George Kennedy, owner of the Club Athlétique Canadien, would step in and purchase the team from O'Brien for $7,500. In the 1910-1911 season, the NHA would shrink from 7 teams to 5 as the Cobalt and Haileybury clubs departed the league. But the Canadiens, for their part, would improve greatly in this second year, with an even record of 8 wins and 8 losses, good enough for second place in the now 5-team NHA. However, the following 2 seasons wouldn't be as promising, with the Canadiens dropping to dead last in 1911-1912 and then finishing 4th out of 6 teams in 1912-1913. By the end of the 1913-1914 season, though, they finished tied for first place with the second-year Toronto Blue Shirts club, thus forcing the NHA to hold its first ever playoff series to determine who would be crowned the league's champion. The 2 teams played a 2-game series for the championship, with the winner based on total goals. George Vezina would lead Montreal to a 2-0 shutout in the first game, but the Canadiens would then suffer a crushing 6-0 defeat in the second, giving Toronto the league title by a 6-2 score. 2 years later, in 1915-1916, the Canadiens would rebound from another dead last finish the previous season by finishing the now 24-game season with a 16-7-1 record, earning them their first ever NHA championship, as well as their first ever berth in the Stanley Cup Finals, where they faced the Portland Rosebuds of the Pacific Coast Hockey Association. With the best-of-5 series tied at 2 wins apiece, the deciding game was held at Westmount Arena in Montreal on March 30th, 1916. With less than 4 minutes left in the game, Montreal's Goldie Progers tallied the winning goal, earning them their club's first-ever Stanley Cup title.
Despite their rise to the top of the hockey world in 1916, the CAC faced financial difficulty after a January fire destroyed its gymnasium and the Montreal Canadiens lacrosse team failed. Therefore, Kennedy decided to separate the hockey club from the CAC and incorporated it in March of 1916 as Le Club de Hockey Canadien, changing their logo to the red C interlocked with the white H that we know today. The H in the logo was supposed to stand for hockey, though the long-standing misconception that it stood for habitant led to the team being nicknamed the Habs.
The Canadiens would repeat as the NHA League champions the following year, defeating the Ottawa Senators in a 2-game total goals playoff series by a final tally of 7-6. But while Montreal repeated as NHA champions, they were unable to repeat as Stanley Cup champions, losing to the PCHA League champion, the Seattle Metropolitans, in a best-of-5 game series, 3-1. After the NHA met its demise in the winter of 1917, the Canadiens were one of 4 of the former NHA clubs that banded together to form the NHL. The Canadiens debuted in the new league with a 7-4 victory over the Ottawa Senators, with their newly acquired forward Joe Malone netting 5 of those 7 goals en route to what would be a league-leading 44 goals in the league's inaugural 22-game season. However, the fledgling league nearly collapsed on January 2, 1918, after a fire destroyed the Montreal Arena, home to both the Wanderers and the Canadiens. While the Canadiens relocated to the 3,000-seat Jubilee Arena, the Wanderers chose to cease operations, reducing the NHL to 3 teams. Playing a revamped split-season schedule, Montreal would be the top team at the end of the first half, but they would eventually lose the league championship to the top team from the second half of the season, the Toronto Arenas, by a score of 10-7 in a 2-game total goal series. But the following season, the Canadiens were once again in the playoff series for the NHL championship. This time, they would be standing in the winner's circle, beating Ottawa by a score of 4-1 over 2 games, thus setting them up to once again play the PCHA's Seattle Metropolitans in the Stanley Cup Finals. The Stanley Cup series, though, that would take place between the Canadiens and the Metropolitans is now best remembered for its cancellation due to the Spanish flu pandemic. With several players from both teams ill with the flu, health officials in Seattle were prompted to cancel the sixth and deciding game.
With his entire team in the hospital or confined to bed, Kennedy attempted to borrow players from the PCHA's Victoria Aristocrats, only to be turned down by PCHA President Frank Patrick. So, with no way to field the team, Kennedy announced he was forfeiting the game and the cup to the Metropolitans. However, the Metropolitans turned it down, as they felt that with the Canadiens decimated by the flu, it wouldn't be sportsmanlike to claim the title. Therefore, the series was left undecided and the cup was never awarded.
Additionally, the Canadiens were dealt a tragic blow when their star defenseman Joe Hall never recovered from the flu and died on April 5, 1919. During the summer that followed the canceled Stanley Cup Finals, the Jubilee rink burnt down, forcing the Canadiens to build Mount Royal Arena as a replacement. Additionally, the team also lost their star player, Joe Malone, who had been on loan from the dormant Quebec Bulldogs as the club rejoined the league in 1919-1920. For the next 3 seasons afterwards, the Canadiens' moderate records would leave them just out of playoff contention. Not only that, the club's ownership changed hands when George Kennedy died in 1921, having never recovered from the 1919 flu. However, things would pick up for the club during the 1922-23 season, when the Canadiens' 13-9-2 record landed them in the NHL Finals against Ottawa. Though Montreal lost the total goal series 3-2 to the Senators, they would build upon their success during the 1923-24 season that followed. With the superstar rookie Howie Morenz playing center alongside sophomore star winger Ariel Joliat, the Canadiens placed second in the league to Ottawa, but went on to defeat the Senators in the NHL Finals this time around to win the league championship and earn the right to challenge the champions of the PCHA and the champions of the WCHL for the Stanley Cup. First up for the Canadiens was a best-of-3 game series against the PCHA champion Vancouver Maroons. With the Canadiens' top scorer Billy Boucher leading the way with the winning goal in Game 1 and both of Montreal's goals in Game 2, the series ended in a clean 2-game sweep of Vancouver. After vanquishing the PCHA's champion, Montreal was then pitted against the crown holders from the WCHL, the Calgary Tigers. In this best-of-3 series, it would be Montreal's Howie Morenz that shined on the offensive front, with a hat trick in Game 1 and then another goal tally in Game 2. Whereas on the defensive front, Montreal's Iron Man goaltender George Vezina held the Tigers to 1 goal in Game 1 before shutting them out in Game 2 to give the Canadiens another 2-game sweep of a Western champion and their first Stanley Cup as a member of the NHL. Following this successful Stanley Cup run, the Canadiens would celebrate their world champion status with a special jersey design for the 1924-25 season, moving their CH logo to their sleeves so they could feature a large World Globe logo crest on their jersey fronts.
Additionally that year, the Montreal Forum, which in later decades would become synonymous with the Canadiens, was open to house the expansion Montreal Maroons. And since the natural ice surface at the Mount Royal Arena was not ready to host NHL games, the Canadiens were invited to inaugurate the arena. The team played the first game in Forum history on November 29, 1924, recording a 7-1 victory over the Toronto St. Patricks.
The Canadiens would eventually take up residence in the Forum in 1926, sharing it with the Maroons until the latter ceased operations in 1938. And in the years following their 1924 victory, they would bring home Lord Stanley's Cup at least one time in each decade for 7 decades, seeing countless hockey legends don the Canadian sweater, and for a large stretch of that time, become the very face of the National Hockey League.